Now this is a much watched video from Rabbi Pinchas Taylor, brilliant, explaining why the body is simply a fleshware device for the conscious verse being. This is a really good video. Thank you to Rabbi Pinchas Taylor.
To veto your decision. That is, when you're about to flip the switch, say, no, I'm not going to do it. I've changed my mind. And the veto didn't have a spike in the brain. So he said, it's not so much that he showed there was free will, but they showed there was free won't. And he commented, he was a religious man, and he said, this is the traditional religious way of understanding human motivation, that we're hit with temptations from our brain, but we have the free choice to do it or not.
Is there any scientific evidence for the existence of the soul? Take a look at this great clip over here with American neurosurgeon Dr. Michael Egnor. He goes through a lot of the scientific research and evidence that has been advanced over the years that points to the existence of the soul. And some of these experiments, some of these conclusions may really surprise you. So we'll watch this clip together and then we'll talk about it. But first, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Check this out.
I saw a number of things over my career that made me question the traditional materialist way of understanding how the brain works. The patients I'm going to show you here are real people. I've changed their names, but they're very real people. The picture on, I guess it would be which side, on your left is an MRI of the brain of a young lady, and the black there is spinal fluid. The brain is the gray stuff there. She's missing about 2/3 of her brain. That's the way she was born. The image alongside of it is a normal brain for comparison. When she was a young baby, we scanned her and found this, and we were rather pessimistic with her family about her chances of having a normal life. She grew up a completely normal person. She was on the honor roll in high school. If you met her today, you'd say, she's a bright young lady. She's perfectly fine, missing 2/3 of her brain. This is a little boy named Joshua. He was born missing also about 2/3 of his brain. And he is that, again, that black space there is just water. He was evaluated by the ethics committee at my hospital, and they recommended that he not be fed when he was born because he was in such terrible shape that it would be better if he passed away. We rescinded that order and fed him, and he's now graduating from high school, perfectly normal young man. Plays sports, he's a great kid. Maggie is a young lady who was in a gifted program when she was young. She was a brilliant young woman, missing most of her cerebellum and part of the central regions of her brain. She has had to have some surgery to take care of fluid pressure there, but she's done very well. She has a master's degree in English literature, and she's a published musician.
So, with the past one, she's missing a limbic system and the cerebellum. The limbic system controls the temporal cortex because all of your brain function, you rationalize the emotions that come from the limbic system, so that this proves because she's got no limbic system and it still works. That's mad, because it's basically the conscious verse installation overriding the wet and running it even though it's defective by using bootstrapping. So if the conscious verse installation can run a damaged brain up to norm level, you can see that our entire conception of humans is wrong. They are simply wetware, robots run by conscious verse entities. And in fact, one can also see that from the conscious verse, the God Emperor, the conscious verse superintelligence, can do the same thing to brain-damaged individuals like Trumpy Boy. So even though the Iranians have done terrible damage to his temporal cortex, he can be restored.
He has cerebral palsy, and he's missing both hemispheres of his brain. The only part of his brain he has is his brain stem. He is handicapped. He can't speak. He can't walk, but he's fully conscious. He's kind of funny. He laughs. He cries. He's an emotionally a normal person, even though.
This one's important because the bastard hasn't got a brain. He's just a brain stem, and it's still running around. Of course, it's drooling, happy drooler, but the body can still operate, but the conscious first installation can't bootstrap this, but can still run the body. So as you can see, a whole conception of what a human is wrong. We're simply conscious first installations into wetware robots.
His entire brain hemispheres. So it raises the question, it sounds like a really strange question, but as I say, it's not so strange. Is the brain the organ of the mind? You know, the heart's the organ of circulation, the kidneys are the organ of making urine, but is the brain completely the organ of the mind? Clearly, in some ways it is, but in other ways it may not be. This question was first addressed by Wilder Penfield, who's a neurosurgeon, worked in Montreal in the mid-20th century, probably the greatest scientist in the neurosurgical profession. And he was the pioneer in epilepsy surgery. And he would do awake brain surgery, meaning that patients during the brain surgery would be fully awake with local anesthesia, so they felt no pain. And he would stimulate their brain to map the surface of their brain to remove foci of epilepsy. And he asked a fascinating question. He said, why are there no intellectual seizures? When people have seizures, if they remain conscious during the seizures, they do one of four things. They'll have uncontrollable movements. Their arm will shake. They can have sensations like tingling on their skin. They can have emotions, powerful fear or laughter or joy. And they can have memories. You can have a seizure where you get this recurrent memory. But nobody ever has a calculus seizure. And nobody ever has a mathematics seizure where you can't stop doing long division. And Penfield said, that's really odd. If you can evoke all these other things, why can't you evoke abstract thought, reasoning, theology, philosophy, thinking about God? It doesn't happen from seizures. And he said the most reasonable explanation is that that aspect of the mind isn't from the brain. He tested this further by intraoperatively with awake patients, stimulating the surface of their brain to map the brain, just like he would map a city, and to find out where different things were located on the brain. Again, so he could protect them in removing epileptic foci. But he couldn't find any kind of abstract thought centers in the brain. There's a movement center, there's a sensation center, there's a visual center, there's a hearing center, there are emotional centers, there are memory centers. But there's no center for thinking abstractly. There's no center for reason. And he said, that's odd. That's the same thing that he found with looking at the kinds of seizures that happen. Some of the most interesting work along this line has been done by Roger Sperry and his colleagues. Sperry won the Nobel Prize for this work. Back in the mid-20th century, an operation was developed for people who would have a seizure in one hemisphere of the brain that would spread to the other hemisphere. And these were catastrophic seizures that were very difficult to control. So what Sperry, an operation that was developed, not by Sperry, but by others, was to cut the brain in half, essentially. So that if a seizure started in one half of the brain, it couldn't spread to the other half. And that made the seizures much easier to control and much milder. And it was called a corpus callosotomy. And we still do that surgery today. So the hemispheres of the brain are functionally disconnected. And Sperry, who was a neuroscientist, realized that you could study what each hemisphere does because they're disconnected. So he did a lot of wonderful work, and the left hemisphere controls speech, the right hemisphere controls spatial orientation, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. But one thing that he noticed, and I've noticed too, is that people who've had their brains cut in half are pretty normal people. As you meet these people, the brains are cut in half, and they're walking and talking, they feel normal. They have less seizures than they used to have. It would be the same thing as if someone just took a chainsaw and cut the laptop in half, and it still worked just fine. Like, there's something odd about this. The follow-up research on that is something that still gives me chills, and I learned about this decades ago, and I think it's among the most fascinating results in cognitive neuroscience. Justine Surgeon was a researcher at McGill in Montreal, worked about 20 years after Sperry, and she studied people with split brain surgery. And what she did was she found a way to present pictures of things, like pictures of arrows, to each hemisphere separately at the same time. So she put arrows up that the right hemisphere would see one arrow, the left hemisphere would see the other arrow, but no part of the brain saw both arrows. One half saw one arrow, the other half saw the other arrow. And she asked the people, are the arrows pointing in the same direction or not? And they always got it right. But how could they compare arrows when no part of the brain saw both arrows? So she concluded that there was something in the mind that wasn't in the brain. Pinto has furthered that research in which he tells stories to split brain patients, where the first half of the story is presented to one hemisphere. The second half of the story is presented to the other hemisphere. But you don't understand the story unless you see both. A good example would be if the left hemisphere can see a baseball, and the right hemisphere can see a broken window. So Pinto would ask the patient, what happened? And the patients always answered, the baseball broke the window. But no part of the brain saw both the baseball and the window. So there's something in the mind that's not in the brain. Wilder Penfield also studied free will, and he did a very interesting study. During these awake brain operations, he would stimulate the surface of the patient's brain, and if you stimulate the right place, you can make them do things, like make them raise their arm. He would ask them during the surgery to occasionally raise their arm themselves without him stimulating them. And you can't feel your brain. The brain has those sensory things, and the patients are under surgical drapes, so they can't see what he's doing. And he would ask them, when your arm goes up, I want you to tell me whether you did it or whether I did it. And they always got it right. Hundreds of thousands of trials of this in 1,100 patients. No one ever missed it. No one ever got it wrong. And he concluded then that he couldn't find any place in the brain that simulated free will. That free will wasn't in the brain. That you could always tell, this is my will. This is not someone doing it to me. So free will is not a brain function. Benjamin Libet did probably the most famous research on free will. And what Libet found, and it would take a while to go into details about how he did his experiments, they were quite ingenious. But he would record electrical signals from the scalp, and these are people who haven't had any surgery, they're just normal volunteers. And what he found was that when you decide to do something simple, there tends to be a spike in brain activity that happens about a half second before you decide. Like if you're going to turn on a light switch. About a half second before you turn on the light switch, your brain spikes.
We were talking about with the remote sensing, remember? The human is run by something he's not aware of, and the brain reacts to it afterwards. Hence, of course, remote sensing is all about getting into the ability to what Shane's called not do, that is, be able to do things while not thinking, which seems an oxymoron, but isn't. That's why they're all about shutting down the internal dialogue, and shamanism is all about not doing. So when you try and do something in the psychic world, you're thinking hard about doing it, when in fact you should be doing the converse. You build the intent to do something, and then in order to do it, you completely switch off. You shut down the internal dialogue and broadcast with strong emotion. So if you want to do something that's positive, positive emotion. If you want to do something negative with negative emotion, but you broadcast, you're completely not doing, which is broadcasting a completely blank consciousness, remote sensing. And if you want to do something demonic and feed demons, well, you've got to hate good and love evil and get yourself into a frenzy of not doing by becoming a mindless automaton, sacrificing Vestal virgins and be totally out of your mind in order to become possessed by interdimensionals, which I've explained, take over your body. And as we've seen from this, since the conscious verse installation is in the body, demonic entities with this worldwide religion of Satanism, which we did in the previous video, is all about getting you to hate good, love evil, hate your free will, love giving it away, so that the interdimensional demonic entities can possess your body. And as we've seen here, they're not just possessing your body, they're possessing your brain too. So when the conscious verse installation tries to run your wetware robot, it can't, because the entire machine has been hacked. And the interdimensional then tries to hack the conscious verse entity, trying to use the wetware robot. See? Easy once you know how.
That you're going to turn it on. So what, and that seems at first glance that everything is driven by your brain. Your brain makes you do it, and you don't really have any free will. It's all just chemicals driving you to do things. But he was a very clever researcher, and what he did is he asked people to veto your decision. That is, that when you're about to flip the switch, say, no, I'm not going to do it. I've changed my mind. And the veto didn't have a spike in the brain. So he said, it's not so much that he showed there was free will, but they showed there was free won't. That is that your brain, and he commented, he was a religious man, and he said, this is the traditional religious way of understanding human motivation.
So, one can see here that your bodies are demonically possessed, your brain's demonically possessed, but it can't do anything unless you give away your free will by being tricked into hating your free will and loving giving it away, so that the interdimensional possesses your body can run you. And as we've seen from this neuro surgeon, the conscious verse installation can veto anything and everything within the wetware robot. So the only important thing for intradimensionals is to make sure that you give away this power. Everything else is irrelevant. Everything else is just bollocks. And Western culture is all about hating your own will and loving giving your will away to someone else. In this case, in the West, it's all interdimensionals. Makes perfect sense. Easy to understand now.
But we have the free choice to do it or not. Because the free choice to do it or not did not have any new brain activity at all. It was independent of the brain. So the brain keeps hitting you with these things, have that extra piece of cake. But you can say yes or no, and you can't blame your brain. Adrian Owen is a researcher, I think he's currently in Indiana, he was at Cambridge in England, did a fascinating study in patients in persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state is the deepest level of coma. It's just a step above brain death. And it happens when people have had very severe brain injuries from lack of oxygen or from motor vehicle accidents. And it's called vegetative because it's been assumed that these people are basically vegetables, meaning that they have no mind. They're just a body and there's no mind left. Some of you may recall the Terry Schiavo stuff that went on about 20 years ago. She was in persistent vegetative state. What Owen did is he put patients in MRI machines and did functional MRI imaging that shows brain activity. And he would ask them to think about things with a headset. He'd say, think about walking across the room, or think about your family, or think about playing tennis. And they would show patterns of brain activation in their very damaged brain. And he then did that with normal volunteers and found the patterns were identical, implying that they were understanding what he was talking about. And then what he did, he was very clever, he asked the same questions, but he mixed up the words, so they didn't make any sense. Instead of think about walking across the room, he'd say, room across, walking about, think. Doesn't make any sense. And the brain was silent. So these people were understanding the questions he was asking, even though their brains were practically destroyed. And he actually found, he and other people have replicated his work, that about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state show clear evidence of being able to communicate. There are people who can do mathematics in persistent vegetative state. You ask them, what's 9 plus 6? You count, when you hit 15, the brain lights up. There are people who can tell their family histories. You know, is your brother's name George? Brain will light up. So you can communicate with people in the deepest level of coma in many cases. Near-death experiences are sort of the paradigmatic example of a separation between the soul or the mind and the brain. And while some near-death experiences may be not genuine, they may be hallucinations or whatever, there's no doubt that there is a real core of real experiences. They're probably about 20% of near-death experiences are veridical, meaning they can be checked. The person knows things that occurred when they were dead, things that went on inside the room, etc. The probably most famous near-death experience was Pam Reynolds, who was an aneurysm patient, operated on in 1991. And in order to safely operate on the aneurysm, her surgeon had to stop her heart after cooling her body down to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And that gave him about 30 minutes to fix the aneurysm. He drained all the blood out of her brain, fixed the aneurysm, and then rewarmed her and started her heart again. And she survived and did very well, actually. She said, in the recovery room, she said, I watched the operation. He said, what? She said, you were brain dead. You couldn't possibly watch the operation. So she said that as soon as her brain went dead, she popped out of her body, floated up to the ceiling, watched the surgery, and she said that her vision was amazingly accurate. It was a beautiful scene. And then she told him what he talked about during the surgery. She told him what the instruments looked like and what music was playing in the room during the surgery. And things like this have happened a number of times. So in my view, there's...
So, to add my pennyworth, we've got the conscious verse installation booted out of the wetware robot and floating around. And of course, if you're an intradimensional, what you want is full possession of the wetware robot, but what you also want is to have this conscious verse installation installed, but in a box which you can then bleed within the installation, as we saw in the It. HBO series with Cameraman, remember? The remote sensor, remote viewer, had his light in a box which the monster, sequestered. Remember, it was all padlocked up and chained up. So, one can see that interdimensional vermin who have no Higgs field, hyperinfinity or light, but gain it by light energy matter beings taught to hate good and love evil, hate free will and love giving it away, need to be installed in wetware so they can then be mined, and this Higgs field, light, free will, whatever you want to call it, I've got all the God tech for it, but you're not capable of understanding, is then downloaded into the intradimensionals, who can then use it to then possess the material light energy world, the realm of matter, which has no assemblage point, but does have an assemblage point when associated with a conscious verse installation. So your human body has no assemblage point when you're dead, but while you're alive, it has an assemblage point. The Higgs field has inhabited and made the quantum information real. So it's for the interdimensionals, they can possess Annabelle or AI or bodies, but the quantum information of the interdimensional can't escape the matrix, two-dimensional Van der Hooft. Information, 2D space, until it's parasitized the conscious verse, Higgs field, light, free will, hyperinfinity, from conscious verse beings that have been tricked into giving it away so that they can then make real the quantum information of interdimensionals. Like possessing a human body or inhabiting a AI and then bleeding off Higgs field from all the souls linked to it to then enable the quantum information to become real. So you're beginning to see the whole picture now, and we just gave you this side of the wetware robot from a neurosurgeon, so you'd understand the picture.
Death experiences are very real. The other thing that for me is very convincing is that people have surveyed the literature. There are thousands of examples of this in the literature, where people go down a tunnel and they see loved ones and relatives at the other end of the tunnel. Nobody in the medical literature who's had a near-death experience has ever seen a living person at the other end of the tunnel. It's not like you kind of want your mother and your mother's still alive and you see her at the other end of the tunnel. Only dead people are at the other end of the tunnel, including people that you didn't know were dead. There are a number of examples of people who were in car accidents where someone in the car died and they didn't know the person died because they were critically injured also, and they saw that person on the other side of the tunnel, but not people in the car who didn't die.
One of the things that I think about when I see videos like this is the verse in Job chapter 10 that says, "You've clothed me with skin and with flesh." In other words, you've clothed me with skin and with flesh. That the me is below the skin and the flesh. The skin and the flesh is the clothing. The me, the I, is below them, is the soul, is something deeper, the person, the mind living within the person. And there's different layers of consciousness, different layers of soul, but that the body is simply a garment. One of the thought experiments that I think about as well is if you imagine yourself in your mind's eye, looking at yourself in the mirror, but rather than your current self looking back at you, you think about your 15-year-old self. Well, you look very different now than you did when you were 15. Maybe when you were 15, you had braces and you had pimples, different hairstyle. And if you backtrack that another 5 years to your 10-year-old self, your 10-year-old self and your 15-year-old self both look different than your current self. Yeah, your 10-year-old self might have had glasses and crooked teeth. Your 15-year-old self had pimples and braces. And if you go back to your 5-year-old self, you have even a different little boy or little girl. And if you fast forward 20 years, you're also looking different. So
we can see with this rabbi's explication that there's a conscious verse installation in the wetware robot, and why I'm going through these wonderful videos is to give you a full picture of what's happening, so you understand that all that the God Emperor's been wittering about is in fact rubber stamped by non-conspiracy theorists.